Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Furlong, and today we're talking natural selection. This is probably the most important video in a biology class, and that is taking a look at the theory of natural selection as proposed by Charles Darwin in his book On the Origin of the Species. Now, many people think that what he is describing is evolution, and he's not. He's providing a mechanism to show that evolution can take place. And so that's what we're going to be taking a look at today. All of biology today is rooted in this theory of natural selection. And so we need to have a good, firm understanding of what it really is saying. Now, recall that Charles Darwin sailed aboard the Beagle as the ship's naturalist, and for a couple of weeks during this 5-year voyage stopped at the Galapagos Islands. This is a small set of islands along the equator just in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of South America. One of the great things about this island is that there are animals and plant species that are not found anywhere else in the world. For instance, there is the blue-footed booby. This is a type of bird. Of course, it has some nice blue feet, but it's a flightless bird. It doesn't have any natural predators, so there's no need to fly. There are seals on this island. There are large populations of iguanas and cacti on this island. There's vampire birds, birds that don't drink water but drink the blood of other birds. And there's penguins. We're talking about the equator, and there's penguins found on this island. One of the many species that Darwin took note of on the island were the giant tortoises. These were big animals, big enough to ride on. But if you take a close look, these two tortoises found on different islands don't look exactly alike. For instance, this tortoise here, look at its shell. It goes way up, whereas on this one, it's rounded over. So this particular tortoise here, this is known as the saddleback tortoise. Because of that notch on its shell, it's able to raise its head way up. The other tortoise with the rounded shell, it can't raise its head up very far. Now, why is that important? Well, the saddleback tortoise is found on drier islands, so it has to be able to reach higher up for its food. Whereas the other giant tortoise, it has lots of vegetation on the ground. It doesn't have to be able to reach its head up very high. And Darwin took notice of this, wondering why is it that if this is the same species, why do they have different shapes in their shells? After visiting the Galapagos Islands, it took him another 20 to 30 years before he finally came out with his theory of natural selection. And we're going to look at the three main points in this theory. The first one is favorable variations. This says that there are slight differences within a species. So in other words, we can see this, that no two individuals look exactly alike, and that these variations may allow for an individual to better compete or to better survive in their environment. Now, having these favorable variations doesn't mean that they're going to survive. It just gives them that chance to better compete and to better survive. What are these favorable variations? Well, it depends on the species. For instance, here it's going to be speed. And if I'm one of these gazelles, I don't have to be the fastest gazelle in order to survive. I just don't want to be the slowest one. Or these polar bears. Why do they have white fur? And actually, if you take a close look, the fur isn't white at all, but it's translucent. And that's because they have black skin. And of course, black allows them to absorb as much heat as they can. By having that translucent fur, they can absorb as much sunlight as they can in order to help keep them warm. Sharks have an endless supply of teeth. This cactus has spikes on it. Now, we might think that these spikes or these needles are used for protection so that they don't get eaten, but really what they do is they cast a shadow and it helps keep the plant cool. This butterfly has what looks like a giant eyeball on there. So if you're a bird flying around looking for something neat, you might think twice about going after something like this. Some are perfectly designed for living underground. They don't need to have eyes. They have this special type of nose that they can sense, and they have special paws that allow them to dig. Some fish will blend in with their surroundings. Here we see a stick bug. There's another stick bug. Hard to tell the difference between the two. Here's one that looks kind of like a leaf. There's another one. Can you see the leaf bug here? Yeah, it's right in the middle. What about this? Yeah, there's a toad. Hard to see. Oh, what about this? Here's one we see around here. They do blend in. There's a deer. Here's another frog. Looks kind of like the surrounding leaves. But sometimes animals stick out though. Why would they want to stick out? Oftentimes when we see colorful animals like this, what they're saying is, hey look, I'm poisonous. You better not take a bite out of me. Poison dart frogs, same thing. They produce a mucus that's strong enough to kill a person. So oftentimes we think though that only the strong survive. This is a very common saying in natural selection. The only thing is it's not true. Strength may be a deciding factor sometimes, but most of the time it will have nothing to do with if an organism can survive or not. Sometimes it might have to do with intelligence. Here's an example of an alligator. Now I took this picture at the Toledo Zoo several years ago. This is a very rare white alligator and you almost never find them. The reason is because they're albino. They don't produce any pigment. Well, alligators need to sun themselves. In this case, the alligator, if he were to go sun himself, he would burn and that would kill him. The only reason why this one survived is because a hunter down in Louisiana happened to come across a whole nest, something like 13 of these white alligators, and took them to the New Orleans Zoo, who then started giving them to other zoos around the country, which is where I saw this one in Toledo. But this is not a favorable variation for alligators. Darwin's second point is that there's a struggle to survive. So organisms are always competing for various resources. They're competing for food, they're competing for water, they may be competing for space or territory, but most importantly, they're competing to mate. So if they have a favorable trait that allows them to get this food, that allows them to get water, that allows them to get space, that's going to give them a better chance to survive. And if they survive, they're going to have a better chance at mating. Just because they survive doesn't guarantee that they'll mate, but it gives them that greater chance of mating. So the ability that they have to survive is based on what variations they have. Do they have a favorable variation? Or do they have an unfavorable variation? That white alligator, that's an unfavorable variation. Never would have been able to survive to pass those genes on, which is the third part of the theory of natural selection, successful reproduction. Basically what this is saying is that if an organism has a good variation, it will have that greater chance to survive, just like we've been talking about. If it survives, then they can mate and pass those favorable traits on to their offspring. So here's where a little bit of genetics comes in. The environment determines which variation allows for that chance at survival. What might be a good variation in one environment could be a bad variation in another environment. In other words, we can say that nature selects for good and bad traits. And if you're successful, you're going to produce offspring that look just like you, that are going to have those same favorable variations. So let's go back to a previous video and we talked about how Lamarck explained why giraffes have long necks, and remember he said that they had to stretch, and the more they stretched their necks the longer they got, which we know of course is not true. Darwin said there is very little competition for food in trees, and so these giraffes that had slightly longer necks had a survival advantage over those with slightly shorter necks. So this is, of course, a polygenic trait. Recall that polygenic traits have a bell-shaped curve, so there's always going to be some with slightly longer necks, some with slightly shorter necks. Most of them are going to have an average size, but those with the slightly longer necks will have a survival advantage. If they are the ones that survive, they're going to reproduce other giraffes that have the same long neck variation, so that over time, the neck of the giraffes continue to get longer and longer. Oh, but wait a minute. Here's the nice thing about science. This was just a hypothesis that was put forward by Darwin as to why giraffes have these long necks. So let's take a look at this video and find out what giraffes may do with their necks. Yeah, you see the giraffes with longer necks, they tend to be better fighters, which gives them a greater chance to mate and produce offspring with longer necks. The longer neck you have, the more of a force you can apply to your opponent. And they have really thick skulls, and so they can maybe knock out their opponent by just swinging their head at their head. And so those with longer necks provide a greater force, have a greater chance at surviving, and being able to mate with the females. So that's just a very quick look at natural selection. We're going to be doing a whole bunch of natural selection experiments in class, and I can't wait to see you then.